President Trump is determined to build out a significant advanced technology missile defense system for the United States, Canada, and frankly for all of North America. His Golden Dome project, which will require comprehensive satellite communications that include not only Alaska and Canada, but more stations in Greenland than are currently available. There are very important shipping lanes that are opening around Greenland now with the warming of waters not only along Russia's Arctic frontier, but also the Canadian Arctic archipelago. And frankly, we have the packed silica now under the Trump administration and a renewed effort to develop quasi-industrial policy to secure access to rare earth elements, critical metals, and minerals that are so critical for building out artificial intelligence, quantum computing, robotics, and data centers of the technology-deep 21st century American and global economies. So all of these together make Greenland a strategic prize, and this all comes down to one fundamental fact.
Hey, let's welcome John Sitilides, keynote speaker, strategist, and senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. Second time on the show. Welcome, John, and good to see you.
Great to be with you again, Danny, with you and your audience. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll talk a lot about geopolitics, different parts of the world, but let's start with Greenland. There have been a lot of news and information around that island in the past 2 to 3 weeks, maybe 4 weeks. So what do you think is the strategic objective of acquiring Greenland by the United States?
If we look back at history, Danny, we'll see that, first of all, there's been some measure of interest in Greenland going back to the 1860s and 1870s, around the time that the U.S. purchased Alaska from Russia. And so Greenland has always been part of the larger vision for comprehensive U.S. security in North America. This was revisited in very significant ways right after World War II. For a number of reasons that will take up too much time, the U.S. decided to forego that effort. And President Trump started talking about Greenland, if one recalls, back around 2018, 2019, publicly, but not quite with the same robust energy that was directed in Greenland's direction as the last year or so. So we have now a renewed interest in Greenland for several reasons. One, first of all, and we see this from the national security strategy that was released in November, the State Department's agency strategic plan in early January, and just a few weeks ago, we had the Defense Department's national defense strategy for 2026, all of which point to very intensive concern in Washington about escalating Russian and Chinese joint air and naval patrols in the emerging strategic theater of the Arctic Ocean. President Trump is determined to build out a significant advanced technology missile defense system for the United States, Canada, and frankly for all of North America. His Golden Dome project, which will require comprehensive satellite communications that include not only Alaska and Canada, but more stations in Greenland than are currently available. There are very important shipping lanes that are opening around Greenland now with the warming of waters not only along Russia's Arctic frontier, but also the Canadian Arctic archipelago. And frankly, we have the packed silica now under the Trump administration and a renewed effort to develop quasi-industrial policy to secure access to rare earth elements, critical metals, and minerals that are so critical for building out artificial intelligence, quantum computing, robotics, and data centers of the technology-deep 21st century American and global economies. So all of these together make Greenland a strategic prize. And this all comes down to one fundamental fact, the concern in the White House that in the event of a conflict or a crisis near Greenland, the current owner of Greenland, Denmark, is unable to defend this massive territory, again, against potential joint air and naval patrols by China and by Russia. And that lack of effective deterrence could trigger a NATO Article 5 response if China and Russia don't feel sufficiently deterred by Denmark's current military posture on the island.
Makes sense. And all of these events in the recent couple of weeks, maybe a month, have caused some, arguments and some political, a little bit of a turmoil inside the West because of Greenland and because of how determined America is to purchase it. So what do you think is the long-term outcome of this crisis, if you can call it that, within the West? Is trust being broken, or do you think it's just part of the negotiating process?
Very much so. I don't see this as a crisis. I see it as a disagreement, perhaps a dispute but certainly not a crisis. But we do need to work out an arrangement where the United States and Denmark, and frankly, the voting public of Greenland, all have a say in what the eventual outcome might be here. And frankly, President Trump, as we know, is not a diplomat. He's not a traditional politician, and he has engaged in very blunt, undiplomatic, and unorthodox strategies here in trying to persuade the Kingdom of Denmark to either sell Greenland, to let go of Greenland and allow it to become an independent nation. That depends on a referendum by the voters of Greenland, and achieve some measure of a condominium between the United States and Greenland. This could result in what we call a compact of free association, Danny, as Washington currently enjoys with island nations and archipelagos in the Indo-Pacific region, specifically Micronesia and the Marshall Islands and Palau. And here we have those governments, those are sovereign governments, independent governments, that allow for the United States to essentially use their territory for mutual defense purposes and for economic development in those relatively poor, still developing island nations in exchange for relatively free access to the American market and to the American territory by their citizens. And so we could have something similar between the United States and Greenland, but there are a number of hurdles to overcome. First of all is, of course, the opposition of most of the Danish public. They're very offended by President Trump's, again, unorthodox, undiplomatic style. The voters of Greenland need to decide whether or not they want to remain a territory of Denmark, whether they want to become an independent sovereign nation. And if it's the latter, do they want that type of a compact of free association with the United States, or something along the lines of what two sovereign countries do with mutual treaties and reciprocity and the like? So we don't know. There are several different options that are available to Washington, to Denmark, to Greenland, and only time will tell. And we still don't know the details of the agreement that President Trump announced at the Davos summit, which the details of which have never been revealed yet. It's been several weeks. And so we're waiting to see to what extent there might be, in the short term or medium term, larger access, greater access by the United States to so-called sovereign bases in Greenland, similar to maybe what the United Kingdom enjoys on the territory of Spain at the Strait of Gibraltar, or what it enjoys in the EU member nation of Cyprus with two sovereign bases on the southern coast of Cyprus. So we'll see how this plays out. Let's get a clearer sense of what agreement, if any, was reached at Davos, and then we can see to what extent the various voting publics can bring about a democratic outcome to this conundrum.
Yeah, so it sounds like most of these scenarios do not imply full control over Greenland or becoming a new state or a territory. It's probably going to be something more of a cooperation or an alliance with a new nation, right?
I don't think there's any desire by any serious planner in Washington, D.C., for Greenland to become the 51st state. First of all, it's an incredibly subsidized island. I think right now it's about $700 million a year that the Kingdom of Denmark provides to subsidize the economy of Greenland. I don't think there's any interest in anything along those lines at all. Again, it would be a matter of a partnership, of a treaty arrangement between the United States of America and eventually, potentially, the sovereign independent nation, democracy, republic, whatever that government might be, of Greenland. And again, whether it's a compact of free association or some other mutually agreed upon mechanism for partnership and cooperation. But no, I don't see any realistic scenario anytime in the foreseeable future for Greenland to become a state of the United States.
Makes sense. And if we consider the timelines, the current administration will be in power for at least the next 3 years, but then you never know how the election's gonna play out. So do you think 3 years is enough for this process, or could it be blocked by a new administration or changes in the US government in the future?
It really depends, Danny. There's no clear timeline here. We don't know if this issue will be resolved in the next 3 years. Again, this has to be a democratically resolved outcome. And we're talking about the voters of the United States, the voters of the Kingdom of Denmark, and the voters of Greenland. It could be done in 6 months. It could take 3 years. We don't know. And then it depends on what administration of what party succeeds that of the current President Trump 47 administration. If it's a Republican administration, it may be someone from the current administration, such as J.D. Vance or Marco Rubio, you could see continued efforts if this matter is not resolved by the end of 2028. If it's a Democratic administration, given the rhetoric that we've heard over the past year, there's a very good chance that a future Democratic administration would simply drop the matter completely and leave Greenland as the status quo situation that it's in right now.
And let's switch to another part of the world, which is Venezuela. Probably about a month ago, Maduro was captured and brought into justice into the United States by the United States military and the current administration. So I think this topic is a little bit less on the radar now in the media, and it's unclear what's actually happening in Venezuela, what the future holds for this country, because the government is essentially the same besides Maduro and his wife, but now they seem to be cooperating with the United States. So what's going to be the future of Venezuela, and is anything going to change in that nation?
Well, we hope the country changes for the better for the Venezuelan people, for all of Venezuela's neighbors, and frankly, of course, for the national interests of the United States, at least from a Washington perspective. I think there are several things that we need to be mindful of here. First is to ensure domestic political stability. As you correctly note, the regime is largely the same, right? Maduro's cronies are in power, whether it's the new president, Delcy Rodriguez, whether it's the interior and defense ministers, who maybe were the most powerful people in the Maduro administration, besides the former president slash strongman. But we want to make sure that we have a measure of stability in the country. And so far, so good. Delcy Rodriguez has agreed to submit a monthly budget to Washington regarding the use of the proceeds from sanctioned oil, right? The U.S. still maintains sanctions on Venezuela's oil. This dates back to when the previous regimes in Venezuela under Hugo Chavez and Nicolas Maduro had expropriated American energy assets and nationalized them in violation of agreements and international law. And so the U.S. is using the proceeds of that sanctioned oil in ways that will directly benefit the Venezuelan people. For instance, medicine, healthcare, food provisions, because socialism has so horribly impoverished this once rich and vibrant nation of Venezuela. So we have a measure of what I would call regime management as opposed to regime change, right? Using the influence of the control over sanctioned oil. We want to see economic development in Venezuela again, to provide for a strong, robust economy again, as the country enjoyed before socialism destroyed the economy, which socialism does in every country around the world. So we want to see political stability, social stability, economic development, and then a return to Venezuela as a normal country so that it's no longer hosting, for instance, Russian military assets. It's not, say, sending oil to China at $20 a barrel discount, which China isn't even paying for. Venezuela was actually using that deeply discounted oil, distorting global oil markets in order to pay down tens of billions of dollars of debt to the Communist Party of China. And of course, it was used as a station in South America for the Iranian militant proxy group Hezbollah, which was engaged in narcotics trafficking, in money laundering, and in actual terrorist training camps on a territory of Venezuela, one of the tiny islands off the Venezuelan coast in the Caribbean Sea, and also sending Venezuelan paramilitary forces to Lebanon to be trained in terrorist tactics and military tactics by Hezbollah terrorists. So we want to make sure that Venezuela is prosperous, potentially democratic at some point, right, with stability and economic development in place, a return to free and fair elections with access to media by opposition parties, right? Not elections for election's sake, but an actual fair, free, and open democratic process for elections, which is the way normal democracy should operate. And then again, normalized relations both with its South American neighbors, and with the United States. And I think ultimately to persuade many Venezuelans who came to the United States illegally, and even those who came here legally, to perhaps return to Venezuela and rebuild that beautiful and once prosperous country again, and to contribute the talents that have been developed here in the United States and help turn Venezuela around. Now, this is all very hopeful. It's very aspirational. It's very optimistic. Will it succeed? We have no way of knowing today. But I think that's the larger plan of the Trump administration. And hopefully we can work with the current regime in Venezuela and potentially the government that is the outcome of a hopeful democratic transition.
And I like that you mentioned China and Russia and Iran in this situation, because this the regime evolution or regime management, as you said, they directly impacts their ability to project power in that region against the United States. So, what message does this change send to China, Russia, and Iran?
Well, we see this again in the three strategies that I led at the beginning of our conversation here, Danny. So, the national security strategy, the agency strategic plan, and the national defense strategy out of the NSC, out of the State Department, out of the Defense Department all make very clear the Trump administration is now reprioritizing at a level we haven't seen in decades, perhaps in over a century, the security and economic prosperity of the Western Hemisphere. In other words, the U.S. believes under the current international order that what we've enjoyed for the last 80 years, this so-called, I'm not sure if it's a correct appellation, but the so-called rules-based international order is no longer sustainable in the United States with $38 trillion in debt, with trade relations that provide for open access from foreign countries into the U.S. market, but very constrained access for the U.S. economy into their markets. And of course, I don't want to say necessarily free riders, but allies that are not paying their fair share, their full share of defense for their sovereign territory. So we see a fundamental change by the Trump administration to reprioritize the Western Hemisphere, make sure this hemisphere is free from security threats from China and Russia, our main adversaries on the global stage, as well as secondary powers like Iran. And we see this happening not only in Venezuela and Greenland, as we discussed earlier in the Arctic region, but potentially for regime change in Cuba, which has been a way station for Russian military operations and Chinese signal intelligence operations throughout Florida, Texas, and southeastern United States, where we have so many military bases, major ports, and other strategic assets of the U.S. economy and the U.S. military. And so the degree to which Cuba continues to house Russian and Chinese military and intelligence operations means that we may want to see the Cuban government change the way it operates with our adversaries, ideally work in a way that is more harmonized with American foreign policy and aligned with U.S. security considerations in the Caribbean Sea. And if not, to see to what extent the continued cutoff of Venezuelan oil and now also of Mexican oil to Cuba might persuade Cuban officials to change their minds more quickly.
Makes sense. And let's shift gears a little bit and go back to Europe and talk about what's happening in Ukraine with
Right.
Russian invasion.
Sure.
Since we last spoke, there were a few attempts for peace negotiations, and it doesn't seem like any of those have changed too much on the battlefield. So, what do you think will happen next there, and what's the geopolitical global implication of the continuation of war in Ukraine?
Well, first and foremost, I think the Trump administration, whether one loathes and detests Donald Trump or one admires him, I think the administration deserves credit for trying to bring about a peace agreement between Russia and Ukraine in a way that the prior administration never did. And frankly, most of our European allies never did. And the idea that we were simply going to arm Ukraine forever was financially and militarily, from an inventory perspective, not sustainable. No exit strategy for 3 years, and unfortunately, hundreds of thousands of Russian and Ukrainian men, soldiers that have been killed in this meat grinder war of attrition, and countless civilians, men, women, and children in Ukraine that have been killed by the Russian military machine. And right now we're at, I don't want to say necessarily a position of stasis, but there's very little movement on the ground along this sort of triple layered defense tier that Russia has built to not allow Ukraine, to regain significant territory that has already been lost over the last nearly 4 years now. Right, the end of February will be the beginning of the 5th year of this horrific war. But the concern I think that most observers see here is that there are almost intractable differences at this point between Moscow and Kyiv. Vladimir Putin insists that Ukraine concede territory that Russia has been unable to win on its own in the Donbas region. Ukraine still controls about 20% of the Donbas region. Russia wants it because they declared Donbas to be a province, a sovereign province of Russia, but the Russian military hasn't been able to seize it or conquer it. from the Ukrainian military. And I don't know how Ukrainian voters will allow a Zelensky government or a successor government to surrender valuable territory that tens of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers have died to protect and just surrender it to Russia when Russia was unable to seize it for themselves. And on the other side, Ukraine needs security guarantees to deter Russia from ever engaging in another invasion of Ukraine again, whether it's the little green men invasion that we saw in 2014 and the annexation of Crimea, or a full-scale armored assault as we saw in 2022. The people of Ukraine deserve a measure of security. The problem is the security that they're seeking would almost necessarily require Western military forces as a tripwire that Russia would not dare cross. But we don't know that we can get Vladimir Putin today, tomorrow, or next week, or next month, to agree to any Western, European, NATO, let alone U.S. military presence in Ukraine. We may be at a point where 95% of the issues may be resolvable, but this last 10% is going to be very, very difficult to reconcile. So we may see the war continuing. I think Vladimir Putin believes that he can continue to attrit Ukraine's energy infrastructure, basically freezing the Ukrainian people over the next several months of very harsh winter conditions there, slowly grind away using a population that is 4 times larger than Ukraine. So Ukraine is running out of soldiers, out of men to involuntarily conscript and bring to the front lines, whereas Russia continues to be able to bring in men from the hinterlands, from central and eastern Russia, away from the urban capitals like Moscow and St. Petersburg. And I think ultimately Vladimir Putin still would like to conquer the port of Odessa, which would essentially mean that he would leave Ukraine as a smaller, landlocked rump self of its former size and power and economic strength. So we don't know what, in the end, are Putin's objectives, but we do know that we have very intractable objectives right now that Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner are trying to help to resolve between Russia and Ukraine, but only time and political will tell, Danny.
Yep, makes sense. And finally, let's talk a little bit more about Iran. And obviously, at this current moment, there is still some tensions between the United States military in the region. Iran, the protests have probably been largely over, that were on the rise about a month ago. I want to hear a little bit about your perspective on what's going to happen next, but then more globally, obviously, Ayatollah is 86-year old or so, and he's going to be out of power probably in the next several years. And I also want to ask you, what do you think will happen to Iran after he's gone, one way or another?
So let's talk about a few points about the current situation in Iran. It seems, and of course, there's no way to conduct independent, legitimate polling in Iran, given the extraordinarily repressive regime that rules there. But there's probably good indications that most Iranians feel right now, ABK, anyone but Khamenei. They're completely exhausted of the utter mismanagement, the ineptitude, the incompetence of the Iranian regime under Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei. This is a country that is running out of electricity. Tehran may be running out of water. They have wasted tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars supporting terrorist activities throughout the Middle East, in Europe, in the United States, building up the former axis of resistance and training terrorists and militants in Gaza in the form of Hamas, in Lebanon in the form of Hezbollah, Iranian proxy militia in Iraq and in Syria, arming the Houthi militia that now controls the capital of Yemen, all at the expense of the well-being of the Iranian people. And so the Iranian people are yearning for some measure of, if not necessarily freedom, the way we consider it in the West, certainly anything but this utterly incompetent and inept government under the theocratic, ideological, radical regime of Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei. One of the reasons that, as you note in your question, that the protests may have diminished recently is because, if reports are to be believed, and I don't know how credible they are, but the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the paramilitary organization that supports the theocratic regime in Iran, may have executed 20 to 30,000 people in a matter of days, a level of slaughter that we haven't seen on the world stage maybe in decades, at least going back to the genocide in Rwanda in the 90s, or the Syrian regime when they slaughtered 50,000 people, Syrian citizens in Homs and other places in the world where we see this kind of ruthless slaughter. What's very sad, first of all, Danny, if I might, is the almost complete silence here in the United States and in European capitals that have been indignant and marching out in the streets, feigning concern and indignance over massacres, over deaths of innocents and of those who are guilty of invasions and attacks and assaults in other countries, especially in the Middle East, with everything that we saw in Gaza, and yet utter silence here against this murderous regime. But going back to your question now, what does the future hold? We knew that after Operation Midnight Hammer back in June, that the Iranian regime would try to rebuild its nuclear weapons program as quickly as possible. We see now both human and signal intelligence that Iran is not only trying to reconstitute its nuclear energy program, but it's also continuing to build out its ballistic missile arsenal. And these are what are most threatening to the Gulf Arab countries that are America's allies in the region, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates. One can talk about whether Qatar is an ally or an enemy or both. Kuwait, Iraq, Jordan, Israel, all of these countries, Oman, in the Middle East, and the degree to which an Iranian reconstituted nuclear weapon and ballistic missile program is a threat to the region. These missiles can potentially reach deep into South Asia, into Northeast Africa, into Southern and Eastern Europe, and also can threaten anywhere from 35 to 40,000 American troops that are based throughout the Middle East and in the Eastern Mediterranean, Africa, and in South Asia. So we're very much concerned about their ability to reconstitute their military threat against American and allied interests throughout the region. As you correctly note, there is now a massive armada that is being built up in the Arabian Sea, in the Persian Gulf, and in the Eastern Mediterranean, and a tremendous pressure campaign on the Iranian regime to end its nuclear weapons program. And it's still unclear, Danny, whether or not there's sort of a consensus in the administration here in Washington as to whether the focus should be simply on ending the nuclear weapons program or also persuading Iran to drop the development of its ballistic missile arsenal and to end the sponsorship of terrorism in the region and to end the sponsorship of Iranian militias and proxies in the Middle East so that it becomes a normal country with normal trade relations. We can lift sanctions. They can sell oil and natural gas, engage in commerce with their neighbors, no longer threaten their neighbors, and bring about the prosperity again of the Iranian people who enjoyed a wonderful quality of life, again, under a repressive regime with the Shah through the late 1970s, but they are now far poorer and far more repressed than anyone had ever promised them 45 years ago when the Iranian Revolution took place. Can Iran become a democracy? That's very difficult. It has no recent history of democracy. It's a very demographically mixed population. Only about half the country is actually Persian. The other half, maybe 40%, are Azeris, Kurds, Arabs, Balochs. So we don't know to what extent there would be an actual democratic transition, but at least a government that is no longer corrupt, that provides for the well-being of the Iranian people, and that can manage the infrastructure and, again, engage in normal diplomatic relations with all of its neighbors is the ideal short-term outcome, whether the people themselves overthrow the Khamenei regime or whether he dies and there's an opportunity for some type of normalized leadership that can bring about economic prosperity and some measure of political freedom, even if it's short of democracy, for a terribly repressed people for almost a half century.
Well, thank you, John, for joining and for sharing all of these perspectives. Yeah, thank you again for joining today.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Danny. Wish you continued success with your podcast and all of your programming. Thank you for having me.